Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom. In today's episode, I'm going to be giving a presentation that's actually an assignment for school on philosophical epistemology. And the presentation is called Reason's Ecstasy. So, let us begin. Epistemology. What can we know? Can we know anything at all? In this presentation, I will attempt to explain the relationship between the knowing subject and the world of knowable things. Firstly, a quick caveat. This is an assignment for my undergraduate class in philosophical epistemology. I have not read several of the philosophers I bring up and am still at the beginning of my studies, so I make no claims of impeccability when it comes to the content of this amateur presentation. Far from it. As I learn more in philosophy and in theology, my excitement steadily grows in front of the infinite vastness of these subject matters. What I do know is that ultimately the sense of wonder in the student can only find its rest in the summum bonum itself. So, to begin with, let's turn to ancient Near Eastern cosmology. So, can we trust our perception? To begin to answer this question, let us turn to history. The ancient Hebrews derived their cosmology from the perception of the world around them. When a Hebrew in the ancient Near East looked in front of himself, he saw a horizon which demarcated the separation between a flat earth, eres, man space, and a vast heaven, shamayim, God space. The Hebrew noticed that water came down from the heavens, and that if he digged deep enough, it would come up from the ground. Thus, the separation of the waters was seen as God's act of creation, where he created space wherein to place a garden full of life. Now, turning to Greek cosmology. So, on the other hand, for the Greeks, based on their perception and based on mathematical principles, the earth was a sphere. There were numerous heavenly spaces which contained within them heavenly bodies, and the earth was made up of the elements, basically earth, water, air, and fire. So, how can we know? Our knowledge of the outside world changes throughout human history based on the tools we use, the worldviews we hold to, and or the conceptual frameworks we are committed to. If our beliefs about the world fluctuate, how can we be certain that our beliefs are accurate? How can we know that they correspond to the world outside of our experience? How can we know that the world is even real? Can we trust our senses? After all, this is what ancient Greek philosophy wrestled with, especially in the debates over the nature of change and of the ontological source of reality. So, Plato and Aristotle, the two great philosophers of antiquity, were Plato and his student Aristotle. Plato held that due to change, the world was not as real as its source, which he thought to be the immutable good. For Aristotle, the mutability of the world was explained by the principles of actuality and potentiality, and the source of all things was pure actuality itself. The story of classical philosophy is one which begins with the investigation of the one thing necessarily taken for granted, that is, that existence is a given, and that philosophy is the inquiry into existence. Hence, metaphysics, the study of being, grounded the entire epistemological endeavor. However, there is a significant shift in the 17th century. So it wasn't until the 17th century that a very significant shift took place in the history of philosophy. Rene Descartes challenged what all of philosophy prior to him took for granted, that is, the primacy of metaphysics. So Descartes began his investigation from a position of universal doubt. The question which constituted this position, namely, how can I know that anything exists at all, led to his famous observation that I am doubting. He realized that he was doubting, or investigating, being. And this led him to the conclusion that I must exist, since there is an I doing such an investigation. So in the diagrams that I made here, above the top diagram, you see a large circle, and underneath it, it says being. So basically, the circle represents reality. In it, you have small little circles. Those are the things which make up reality, the things within reality. One of those circles has two sticks sticking out, and it says thinking above it. That represents the mind's outward motion towards knowledge of things outside of itself. Now, what Descartes did is he basically took this entire paradigm, and instead of being, it's underneath the circle, it says universal doubt. And so doubt is what basically covers everything: the entire circle, the things within the circle, and even the self. But the thinking is still happening. And so what Descartes thought is basically what I tried to diagram here in this slide. In other words, the famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, in Latin, which Descartes wrote in French, but it's been coined in Latin. So on the top diagram, you have a badly drawn magnifying glass that is meant to zoom in from the larger picture of the previous slide into a closer look of the thinking subject. And so what he does here is he takes that thinking and then concludes that based on the fact that he is thinking, that he's experiencing this moment of doubt or investigation, that he must therefore exist. And that's how he comes to the existence of his self. Now, obviously, this leads to a kind of solipsism which becomes very problematic in the history of philosophy. So this next slide here shows basically the great reversal that took place in Descartes' philosophy. Whether he meant this to happen or not is besides the point. But what happened was metaphysics used to be prior to epistemology, as we've just seen, but suddenly, because of Descartes, epistemology took priority and became prior to metaphysics. So we have this reversal here, as the diagram shows, where being is the center from which the thinking takes place. But now we approach being without taking it for granted, but through epistemology we try to discover it. So, in other words, Descartes put the cart in front of the horse. So as we will see below, if I begin as Descartes begins, I have begun wrongly. So I've begun wrongly because I took the doubter and his doubting for granted without any reason to do so. So being must be primary, or else there would be no I, and there would be no doubt or thinker or anything. And so we have to take it for granted. It has to be a first principle, or else our position is one of incoherence. So Descartes' statement should have been, I am, therefore I think. But that wasn't really what he was setting out to do. But the ramifications of what he set out to do, as we will see, are pretty bad, pretty devastating. So, among the many disastrous consequences of the Cartesian priority of epistemology over metaphysics is substance dualism. Unfortunately, almost everyone thinks this way. You find it in literature, you find it in movies, you find it in culture, you find it amongst your friends, even family members. Only if you go to school to study philosophy do you even become aware of this conception of the human person or human being. Now, we move to Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant from the 18th century would have us think that all we can know is our experience, not the external world of reality itself. Now, this is really interesting. It actually follows from Descartes pretty logically. If Descartes doubts being on a universal scale and begins with epistemology, with this kind of certitude of knowledge, which comes from the fact that he is investigating, he is doubting, he is thinking, well, then the outside world is not available to certitude, to knowledge. Even though we might experience something, we can't know for sure that it's actually reality. And what further seems to confirm this observation is what I brought up in the beginning of this presentation, which is the fact that the way we understand the world actually does change throughout history. And we come to know things more deeply or differently, or there's paradigm shifts, or things are debunked. So at the end of the day, how can we know that any of it is real at all? So basically, Kant said, yes, it's real. There's something outside of us, but we can't really know it as it is. All we can know is our experience, which is not the same thing. So this is Kant's categories of the phenomenon and the noumenon. So when we're talking about phenomenology, we're talking about the study of our experience. And when we're talking about the noumenal world, we're talking about the real world apart from our experience, which according to Kant, we cannot know. Now, Edmund Husserl, or Husserl, is a 19th and 20th century German philosopher. He's often called the father of phenomenology, and he focused more on the subjective experience rather than on the objective grounds for the possibility of any experience in the first place. So this naturally follows because he's in that Cartesian and Kantian line of thought. So basically, he's focused on man's experience and wants to understand that experience more deeply to better understand it. He does attempt to restore the relationship between the outside world and the thinking subject. But unfortunately, he's working within a paradigm that is going to lead to his failure when it comes to that endeavor. So, here's Husserl's theory: noematic and noetic. So, Husserl went on to develop two poles of experience qua experience, what he called the noematic and the noetic. In the noematic, the thought about the object is considered, while in the noetic, the thinking of the thought is considered. So these two poles characterize the phenomenon of the experience which is in between the individual and the object under consideration. In other words, in our investigation of knowledge, we can focus on the object as being thought, or on the subject's thinking of the object. According to Husserl, the more we deepen the former, the closer we are to knowing reality. But this endeavor ultimately fails to ground reality, since it presupposed that the individual mind is the ground of any real certainty regarding reality. So as we saw, this is doomed to fail, because how do we know that the thought of the object is accurate? How do we know that there is an object at all if we start with the thinking subject and not with being itself? So Martin Heidegger, a return to the primacy of metaphysics. So Martin Heidegger was a German 20th century philosopher. In his work, Being and Time, he challenged these Cartesian presuppositions which claimed that the sole ground for knowledge is consciousness. It cannot be the thinking subject that grounds all of philosophy. Rather, it must be being itself. In other words, metaphysics must precede epistemology in any philosophical investigation. So here in this diagram, we see the undoing of Kant's division, in the sense where it's not a complete division. So in the earlier diagrams, the circle that was before the two lines where the word thinking was placed was the circle that represented the existence of the subject, and then the thinking proceeds from that. But the problem is, with Descartes, you take that circle away, and then you try to prove that circle with the thinking above the two lines. And so what that creates is a separation between the thinking and the reality and existence of the outside world. Now, what Heidegger does is he restores the primacy of being, and so in a sense he begins to lay the foundations for the tearing down of the wall that separates the outside world and the self. And the way this happens is as follows. in this diagram, we see how it works. So Heidegger claimed that human beings are fundamentally, quote, in the world, which means that the starting point of philosophy presupposes the world and not the individual Cartesian mind. So this is kind of what I mean by the restoration of the union between world and person. So the world of being is what grounds the thinking subject and the outside world around the thinking subject, the world that the thinker is thinking about or receiving impressions from. So the world of experience, where things come into contact with him. So what can we know so far? So being is the first fact. We also know that I am aware of this fact, and thus I am an existing being in the world of being. I'm thinking and perceiving, and perception is not I, but it's the reception of other in I. So there has to be external beings. Now, the subject and the object. Much can be deduced from the primacy of being, namely the principle of non-contradiction, the principle of sufficient reason, and the principle of causality. Now, someone might bring up David Hume and his famous supposed rebuttal of causality. Most people, if I'm not mistaken, think that it's pretty absurd. I'll have to look more into that. But in other words, correlation does not necessarily imply causation, but causation does imply correlation. So what we're talking about here is a philosophical principle, not necessarily what we observe in nature. So if in nature I see a correlation, it's very plausible that there is also causation. Most of the time there is, but we can't know that for sure with philosophical certitude. The reason why is because, as we've seen, our understanding of the world changes in time, and we might discover later on that the actual causes of something was something else, and it just seemed to be correlated. But the principle of causation itself can't be denied, because if you do, then you can't speak of philosophy at all. You can't have a rational conversation. I wouldn't be able to give this presentation, because the principle of causality is a structure of the intelligibility of being. Whether we can see it or not in specific instances is irrelevant to the fact that it is necessary for any rational discussion. Okay, so I can know with certainty, based on the primacy of being, that these principles apply to the beings outside of me. Why? Well, because they exist. Because I am receiving the experience of something entering my world of experience. So these principles are a source of certainty, a certainty that is absolute, or else being is not being, and we are back at square one via an absurd route. So although at this point I can't fully know the beings outside of myself, I can know my experience of the beings outside of myself. So here we have a little bit of the Kantian language. Since the experience is within me, it's been received by me, so I can come to know that. But this implies that outside beings are acting upon me. And so here, Father Norris Clark, in his book, The One and the Many, responds to Kant's radical separation between the noumenon and the phenomenon. He says that besides experience, quote, things in themselves act on us, on our senses, and action that is completely indeterminate, that reveals nothing meaningful about the agent from which it comes, is incoherent. It's not really action at all. So in other words, my perception receives at least something true from this outside world, namely that I have received from an actor an action that has affected me in a specific way. And that action comes from an actor. And there's many different actions that I receive from actors outside of me. So I can know that different actors, give different actions. I can learn something from that. So before further investigating the nature of this outside world, I'm going to now turn to focusing on the thinking subject before we return. So the incarnate person. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, a French philosopher, here's a quote from one of his works. Quote, "The perceiving mind is an incarnate mind. I have tried, first of all, to reestablish the roots of the mind in its body and in its world, going against the doctrines that treat perception as a simple result of the action of external things on our body, as well as against those which insist on the autonomy of consciousness. These philosophies commonly forget, in favor of a pure exteriority or a pure interiority, the insertion of the mind in corporeality, the ambiguous relationship which we entertain with our body and, correlatively, with perceived things." So in other words, with Merleau-Ponty, we have a return to the unity of man. So Heidegger's undoing of the Cartesian debacle led to Merleau-Ponty's undoing of the dualist perception of man. This is significant because it places us within the world, within a field of relations, all the members of which share in the commonality of being. So this is the common ground that begins to break down the radical divide of Kant's phenomenon and noumenon. So, the outside world. Now that the existence of the world and of man in the world has been reestablished, we can investigate its nature. Firstly, it is a world which we are a part of and which we are in relationship with. So, we're going to turn to St. Thomas Aquinas to investigate his distinction between essence and existence. So what is the relationship between the existence of things and their existence as such and such things? St. Thomas accounts for this with his distinction between essence and existence. So existence determines essence in the sense that it is act, and through it the essence has being, but as potentiality to be the existence of this or that kind of essence. So I'm going to try to break that apart and explain it. So this slide is titled "The Ground of Reality." So now, if this outside world exists, right, has being, then it must have a reason for its being, according to the principle of sufficient reason that we mentioned above. So here St. Thomas's distinction between essence and existence leads us to the conclusion that there must be an ultimate ground for the existence of the outside world, and that this ground must be its own sufficient reason, right? PSR, principle of sufficient reason. That is, its essence must be its existence. If it's just an essence that is this or that, and it's not existence itself, then it requires to receive existence from something else. So I'll reread that phrase. This ground must be its own sufficient reason, or else we have a vicious regress which would violate the principle of sufficient reason. Thus, the pure act of existence itself, what we will call God for the sake of simplicity, is the cause of all that exists, myself, my perception, and the world outside of me. So here I have two different diagrams which are trying to convey the same thing. In the top one, the essence is basically the receptacle, the circle that receives. Existence is being poured into the essence, and so you see the red there is titled existence. That's just one way of visualizing it. Another way maybe is the diagram below it, which basically the essence is the shape of the circle, which is why I basically kind of cut it in little pieces there to show that the shape, apart from the presence of the actual circle, and the existence is the circle, not just the conceptual idea of a circular shape. So I'm not sure if that's helpful. That's how I like to think about it. Okay, ipsum esse subsistens. There is a causal relationship between God and the world, and between God and me, since the world and I exist, and we do so by receiving this existence from God. This means that existence is participatory and relational. So, in this weird diagram, I'm trying to convey how I'm thinking of this. God is the source of existence. He's existence itself. And so essences are receptacles in a certain sense. They're a limited participation in existence. I think Father Clark put it that way. In other words, they receive, I filled them in red because they're receiving existence as a star, a square, a circle, etc. And so those are different essences receiving existence, but I also put lines between the essences to show that they're, in a sense, all interconnected because they're all in the world of existence, in the world of being. And so it's basically a field of relations. And this kind of makes me think of what St. Paul says in Acts, I think it is, that God is Him in whom we move, live, and have our being. Okay, the good. So, since being is relational, it can be said to be good. So, Clarke explains that the good, which is transcendental, and what that means is that it's applied to everything that exists, it's applied to all being. The good does not signify some characteristic of a being taken purely in itself without reference to anything else. So in other words, it's not an individual thing. To call something good, although it still denotes something in the being itself, adds on the connotation, at least implicitly, of relation to some valuer, some appetitive dynamism. So when you say something is good, you can't really say that of something that is purely and totally individual. It's good insofar as it's in relation to something else. So Father Clarke adds that, quote, the good appears as the objective correlate. The good appears as the objective correlate in being to our subjective inner dynamism of desiring, loving, valuing, admiring, both in the sensitive and the spiritual orders. Hence, I come from God, all right? I received my existence from existence itself, the pure act of God, and I search a way back to Him since I am and I think. So I'm kind of playing on the Cartesian phrase here. So I'm attempting to know being. So I'm trying to know God, who is being itself, existence. He's the foundation of everything that exists. And so this brings us to the concept of relation and its relationship, pun intended, to revelation. Now, I'm not using the word revelation in the theological sense here. So it would be a contradiction of what was said above to hold that there is an active and intentional deception in the world's revelation of itself to me, especially since I am dynamically oriented toward being, toward the good by nature. That's what it means to be what I am. Hence, quote, the good signifies the object or being itself that is valued, but considered precisely as the object of valuation with relation to some valuer. So, deception is an evil, since authentic revelation is required for relation to be genuinely affected. So we desire to know being because it is good for us to do so, and it is good for us to do so because of our inquisitive nature. So if it were impossible to know reality, completely impossible, at least in a basic manner, then the good could not be known by the one who seeks it. And that's evil by definition. And so this would mean that God is evil. So existence itself is evil, which is a contradiction based on the above principle of goodness as a transcendental of all being. So if we start with being as the first fact, then we see that there's principles that follow from that, like non-contradiction, sufficient reason, and causality. Now, if the world is deceiving me, and I can't trust my senses at all, I'm not saying completely, I'll try to get into that a little further. But if the world is actively deceiving me, kind of like Descartes' evil God idea, then there's a sense in which the world of being is evil because it's not in relation with my search for knowing it. And my search for knowing it shows that I exist and I have a desire for the knowledge of the existence of other things. And those other things are good because they're in a field of relations in which I am, because we saw with Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty that we're getting rid of this Cartesian dualism and we're grounding the human person in the world again through his body. And so, in other words, based on this framework, a lot of which comes from St. Thomas and his meshing together of Aristotle and many other sources, well, in that framework, it's actually a contradiction to say that the world is actively deceiving me, like completely deceiving me. So it seems to me that it's not the world deceiving me that is the cause of our lack of certitude. It's more on the side of the thinking subject, and this leads us into an observation from Plato. So, reason's ecstasy. So Plato tells us in Letter 7 of the Republic, quote, "For every real being there are three things that are necessary if knowledge of it is to be acquired. First, the name. Second, the definition. Third, the image. Knowledge comes fourth. And in the fifth place, we must put the object itself, the knowable and truly real being." So, in other words, as David Schindler explains in his book, Plato's Critique of Impure Reason, quote, "Knowledge is not reason's destination. After knowledge comes the real being itself, which is knowable." Thus, Schindler adds, for a soul to join with its object, it does not take the object into itself, as it seems to in Aristotle, but goes out in some sense to enter into the object. And so reason is essentially ecstatic. So I have a diagram here, again, another poor diagram, but I'm trying to show what I think Plato and Schindler are saying here, which is at the bottom you have reason, so that's our faculty, that's us, and and then at the top you have the thing itself that we're trying to come to know in the outside world. So we know that it has a name, so I don't know, dog. We know that it has a definition. It's a mammal. It's got 4 legs. It barks, etc. Then you have the image, which is, well, I mean, think of the image of the last dog you've seen. And finally, knowledge. So we can recognize what a dog is. We know what it is, and we have a certain grasp on its purpose, its reason, its how it came about, what it's made of, etc. But at the top, there's the thing itself, which is not just a definition of it, right? It's not the definition of the thing; it's the thing. It's not an image of the thing; it's the thing. It's not the name of the thing; it's the thing. And it's neither is it the knowledge of the thing; it's the thing itself. And so, reason is not meant to merely extend itself and stop at knowledge. Reason is meant to go out of itself and enter into the thing itself. And so, in other words, it's meant to be ecstatic. It's meant to step outside of itself. So it's kind of paradoxical what Plato is telling us here. Okay, and so ascent to God. So turning to St. Bonaventure. So St. Bonaventure acknowledges the bottom-up process of abstracting form from sense data. So he says this, quote, in order to arrive at the consideration of the first principle, he's talking about existence itself, God, which is the most spiritual being and eternal and above us, we must pass through vestiges which are corporeal and temporal and outside us. So also this next quote of Bonaventure sounds very similar to Aristotle's De Anima. He says, quote, man, therefore, who is called a microcosm, has 5 senses that serve as 5 portals through which the knowledge of all things existing in the visible world enters his soul. So I have the diagram here. It's a previous diagram that I've inverted. At the top is existence, God, and then all the essences are below. And there I put man, and the circle is meant to represent his rationality and how it reaches out to all the essences, and through them the soul ascends to God. So the mind, is what Bonaventure says, ascends to God, because it sees the essence existence distinction in all the existence, in all the things that exist in the world, in the field of relations. Okay, finally, this is a quote taken from Joseph Ratzinger's book Eschatology. It's really interesting. I read it about a year and a half ago, and it's helped me so much understand how the scriptures use the word. And so it says, soul is nothing other than man's capacity for relatedness with truth, with love eternal. And so this gets into the ascent of reason's journey towards God, because it's meant for a communion with God himself. And so this gets into the nature-grace debate with in theology with some of the neo-scholastics and de Lubac on is the beatific vision the final end of man, or is there such a thing as a natural end apart from grace? But that's not for this course. Okay. Creatures of becoming. So hopefully this presentation has shown that investigating perception must be grounded in the primacy of being in order to avoid the gulf of radical skepticism. In fact, a phenomenology which is grounded in a sound metaphysics can both inform metaphysics and complete it, moving our, well, I don't know about complete it, but moving our philosophical knowledge further and further toward the infinite horizon of being. So, in conclusion, as agents of truth in a world of existing beings created by existence itself, which is all good, I can be certain of basic truths, although this is not exhaustive knowledge, and I can come to know being more and more as I continue in the process of becoming. So learning more about the world, being more disciplined in how I know, and being in relation to others and to other things. So I'll conclude this presentation with 2 quotes from sacred scripture. And the first one is from Romans chapter 1. It's verse 20. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. The next one is from John chapter 16, verse 13. When the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all the truth. Thank you for listening to my presentation. If you're a regular listener of the Logos Project, please don't forget to leave a review, to like, subscribe, and You can support us on Patreon, www.patreon.com/thelogosproject. You can check out my website, where I plan on having some interesting blog posts. Thank you, and we'll see you guys next week.